What I think you're going to see today is a summary of some really interesting work that I've been doing since going back and forth to Australia and Canada and working with other scientists around the world that are seeing some very similar patterns in how active management is transforming landscapes to the degree that the active management that we're seeing is amplifying climate change impacts. And what I will be presenting today is kind of a summary of work that's been done with colleagues in Western North America, including Canada, Eastern Canada, Australia, and parts of Europe. And I'll try to summarize this in a very kind of my way in terms of some of the research that we've already published and the research that is in press and coming out any day now that hopefully will inform the debate around the Fix Our Forest Act, if there's still a chance to kind of influence that and get it out of and making sure that it doesn't get through the Senate. Anyway, I think this will help regardless of what happens with that. So when I was a young graduate student and doing my PhD work, I read George Orwell's book, 1984, and that book left quite an impression on me because I think it really applies today. And Orwell was right. He's just 4 decades ahead of his time because we're going through this right now. And you can see this in the Trump administration with how they've turned the Department of Defense into the Department of War now. So war is peace. Freedom is slavery, which are attacks on free speech. Freedom of the press are good examples of how they're doing this. Ignorance is strength. Well, defund education, which they have been doing as well. Keep everybody ignorant of the consequences, which is part of their game plan. He who controls the past controls the future. We had a peaceful January 6th riot on the Capitol. Who controls the present controls the past. There are good Nazis as well as bad Nazis. So the whole active management approach is not quite Orwellian, but it's pretty close in terms of misinformation and how that is influencing what happens in the forest. And you could see some of the misnomers that are applied there. Active management fireproofs forests. It's resilience for climate change. It's being used to protect big trees. It can protect spotted owls from fires. The science on thinning is settled. And if you happen to catch the point counterpoint articles published in Manga Bay between myself and Paul Hesburgh, who claims that the science is already settled, and we now have a paper that's in review that's going to refute that. And the precautionary principle is analysis paralysis. So do no harm to landscapes and to species is getting in the way of active management. So not quite Orwellian, but it's pretty darn close, as mentioned. So I wanted to just kind of pick apart what is active management. And you could see for yourself the Orwellian doublespeak that's leaking through here. And this is some of the rhetoric that Bruce Westerman was using back in 2017, which still applies to the Fix Our Forest Act in front of the Senate right now. And I testified in one of his hearings, and we went at it over this, that this is all kinds of misinformation, that we can use logging to proactively manage forests to confront wildfire disease and insects and blaming the fires on the lack of management and giving the Forest Service even more tools to address these issues, which you'll see later on as degrading forest and just kind of advancing forward in time. We're seeing and continue to see these gigantic categorical exclusions, these emergency determinations with little review or restrictions, and the so-called condition-based management instead of a hard look at the NEPA process. And all along, the public and scientists get shut out of the process. And the fire misinformation is a type of cognitive dissonance that we cover in Nature's Phoenix. the book that Chad Hansen and I put together a couple of years ago. And what it comes down to is the truth in all of this is in the eye of the beholder. What you see is what you get. So that begs the question, how can two truths exist simultaneously? So if you look at fire as a self-willed process, a force of nature, there really is no good or bad fire. And then there's the other side that says the only good fire is a low to moderate burn. And these two exist in a tension state with, if you look at ecosystems as self-willed, which is what I do, then truth in nature is what you see. And ecologists see fire as a necessary process. But if you look at it as a way to command and control nature, then managers see fire as an apex predatory process to be controlled at all costs. Each side will publish its peer-reviewed studies, but each side is operating in a silo of views. I would argue that the naturalist side is more holistic, whereas the management side is more dominance over nature. And we've had this in our background for millennia. So I'm going to kind of pick apart the different arguments now about active management. There are a lot of different types of active management. I'll go through what I mean as the slides progress, but let's start with one of them, which is thinning can increase structural complexity in forests. And I'm going to use the categories that the IPCC uses in the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change reports, degrees of confidence based on my knowledge of the literature. So I would rank this one as moderate to high degree of confidence that we do know how to structurally create from a forest that has, or a plantation in this case, that has very little or no structure. We could do stops and gaps and thinning, variable space thinning, it's called, creating some structure. We could reduce tree competition and then accelerate the growth rates to get to older age characteristics sooner, which is what's happening in the Pacific Northwest. There are costs involved, but those costs are less so than a high integrity forest that you'll see later on. So there's some evidence that this can be beneficial. The other argument is thinning lowers fire risks. And there's
Yes,
some confidence around this. There are a bunch of meta-analyses that have been published that show you can lower fire
I
risk
try
under
to
very narrowly constrained
eat this wood.
conditions. The confidence drops way off when you view the problem holistically, as I do. As that one slide showed you, you look at the forest holistically versus just one specific issue or question. And it's it's largely ineffective under extreme fire weather. So when the winds are blowing, when there are drought conditions, it's going to go right through anything you've done on the ground. You can, as a result of thinning, you can increase wind speeds and the flammability of plants that come in, especially weeds that are in the burn piles. Some of them are flammable. You get drying, changes in the microclimate, edge effects. You lose the the species that need dense canopies. It doesn't last very long, and you have to follow it with burning, and you can't overburn, otherwise you got problems with the understory treatments. So you can reduce it, and some will say that we can even reduce it under extreme fire weather. That might be the case. I have doubts around that. But if to do that, you transform the forest to a point where it's no longer a forest. It becomes a weed infested open savanna system that bears little resemblance to the forest that was there before thinning. So when you look at it holistically, it really kind of drops off the level of confidence, especially in a changing climate. And then there are the collateral damages, and those are scalable depending on intensity and what's removed. And we often see language like this: fuels treatment. Forests are not fuels, they're ecosystems. It's being done for resilience. It's being done for disturbance restoration, forest health. It's climate smart, but in reality, it's degradation in practice. You see the markings on those trees there. This is a BLM project that is in Southwest Oregon, where they were taking out those big fire-resistant trees to save that pine, the smaller pine in the middle. And so what they are removing are the structural elements of the forest to enhance pine growth, but they're actually going to raise the hazard on the site by leaving a lot of ground fuels and opening up the canopy. So we see this often in these projects where they take the large fire resistant trees, and that is not restoration, it's degradation. I mentioned the exciting work that we're doing with researchers around the globe, and seldom do you see biogeographical patterns like this in nature. And when you do, it's a big deal. And we've been publishing these papers that are kind of cross-continental comparisons of what's driving these wildfire increases and looking at the root causes more than just the effects. And what we are seeing is that there's a strong climate signal that's related to temperature increase, especially in the springtime and the summer, that's also related to early spring snowmelt. That's also related to drought conditions and high winds that are really driving these fast fires. So this is the big deal that we're publishing on that's cross-continental. The wildfires are moving fastest and most intense in heavily logged areas under extreme fire weather. So logging is amplifying the speed and intensity of these fires that are being driven largely by the changes in climate. And this is all projected to increase depending on the emissions and the logging levels in the coming decades. And many of these wildfires that are spilling over into urban areas are actually coming from heavily logged areas on private lands, and yet all the emphasis is on public lands treatments. And contrary to what you're hearing by in Congress and in decision makers and this administration with their Orwellian speak, you cannot log, thin, or suppress your way out of this fire problem. There's no quick fix solution. And everything that I've seen is not treating the root causes, it's treating the effects. And in many cases, treating the effects is going to make the situation worse. So we need a paradigm shift that's critical to adapting communities and ecosystems to the changing climate. And that's aiming treatments at the structure itself and a very narrow zone around structures, as in the next slide. And the slide you see here are treatments around the home itself and the home. And you can see Richard Nixon there holding a hose on top of his house back in the early, I guess it was 1950s historical photo. So he knew something about defensible space. Why aren't the agencies doing this? All the treatments are happening in the backcountry. And what we've been doing with our research work in the US is taking a look at treatments in relation to distance from the nearest structure. I don't have time to go into all of the figures that you see there, but we've published 3 papers on this now already. And the Northern Rockies, the Southern Rockies, the Mogollon Highlands in Arizona, and we're looking at the Klamath-Siskiyou now. And we've looked at all the Forest Service treatments that you see in the graphs down below that area figure in relation to distance to structure, whether it's thinning, chipping, prescribed burning, combined treatments. We looked at it all in relation to at the distance to nearest structure. And we're finding pretty consistently across these regions, anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of the hundreds of agency so-called fuel reduction treatments are over a kilometer from any structure. And yet we know the most effective treatments are at the home interface itself. So treating in the backcountry is going to do absolutely nothing to save communities, yet we hear this advertised all the time in the Orwellian speak around these treatments. The one thing that they can do that is a root cause treatment is to close and obliterate more roads. And this slide shows in different colors the percentage of human-caused fire ignitions in different counties across the US over a 2-decade period. Collectively, over 80% of the fires across the continental US have a human cause. Close the damn roads, obliterate the roads where you can, and you'll resolve at least some of this root cause. We can't control lightning, but we can reduce the incidence of human caused fire ignitions by dealing with the road system. I get a lot of this, especially in my work in the Rockies, that beetle killed areas are linked to intense fire. And that simply is not the case. There's a whole slew of studies at the bottom of the screen here that have shown the opposite happens. And the reason for this is if you look at that photo, the canopy in those dead trees is gone. There's no living foliage to burn. And so it's a very short period of 1 to 3 years that the needles are still on those trees. And when they drop, there's no way a crown fire is going to move through that system. So every study that's been done has delinked this supposition that beetle-killed areas are linked to intense fire, but you hear this all the time. And so you could argue, well, let's go in there and get the trees while they still have needles on them. But then you're bringing all that fine fuel onto the ground at the same time, which is going to cause a flash fire if you do get an ignition. And you also are having collateral damages to the surviving trees, that many of which contain the genetic adaptations to get through the next insect outbreak. So it's just another one of these failed strategies that's going to make the problem worse. So we got this paper's coming out in the next couple of weeks in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I wish we could have got it out there sooner, but the peer review took a while. But it's this whole notion of dead trees being linked to the fast fire problem. That is not the case. In fact, what we did, and you hear this in the rhetoric around the Fix Our Forest Act, that look at the fires that took out these big towns. And Bryant Baker actually did this map for us. And what we did was we looked at those deadly Los Angeles fires from last year. Only about 1%, 1 to 3% of the area burned was actually in forest. And yet you hear all of this messaging that if we could only thin the forest, these big towns won't burn down. Well, this fire had nothing to do with forests. We get this a lot, which is post-fire salvage logging removes fuels. And, I've done some work up in the Biscuit area in Southwest Oregon. That's when Dan Donato was doing his famous study about how the Forest Service salvage logging was actually increasing fine fuels and priming the system for a subsequent high severity burn and a flash fire, because the fine fuels are left on the ground, and that's what gets fires to move quickly through a system. So again, it's the opposite of what they're claiming. We get this a lot too. Logging increases water yield. And again, very low confidence of this. What you get is a short spike in peak flows as you remove vegetation, and then a rapid uptake in water by plants that are coming back, and a reduction in water flow. So it's just not sustainable. And you also get an increase in the evapotranspiration of the regrowing vegetation. So you've got a net loss of water in the system. And your quantity may go up slightly in a short period of time, but your quality goes down tremendously, because in order to get into these areas, you have to have a network of roads, and that's a problem with sediment and water quality issues. So that argument doesn't hold either. It doesn't hold water, I should say. I actually generated this study after being in a congressional hearing. I think it was with Bruce Westerman and company back in 2016 or so, that they got very upset at me about this whole active management thing and said that the problem was the protected areas, that they were burning out of control because you couldn't get in there and manage the system. And that's the main fire problem. So I went back and I worked with Curtis Bradley at the Center for Biological Diversity and others, and we put together this analysis. We said, let's test it. It's a workable hypothesis. Let's see what we find. This is the largest study ever done to date. And what we found is we examined 1,500 fires over I think it was a 10-state western region, 23 million acres, mixed conifer, ponderosa pine, using the government data set on high severity burns or burn severity. And what we found was the opposite, that the greatest amount of high severity in red that you see on the right of the slide was coming out of private lands. The lowest amount of high severity was coming out of protected areas. And that was published and it's never been challenged. And yet you put this out there and you still get the misinformation. And that pertains to roadless areas too, I should add. Okay, so I know that high severity is getting a lot of attention, but this is not the boogeyman. In fact, these areas that burn in high severity are some of the most biodiverse forests that we see in the Western United States and Canada. And this is the book that Chad and I did on the second edition of that came out a couple of years ago. We call it complex early seral forests. They're as biodiverse as old growth. And I'm going to show you why it's not an eco catastrophe, because nature is not linear, it's circular. This is a concept that David Lindemeyer out of Australia and I put together in my last visit. And when I was in school, when George Orwell was writing 1984, we were taught that succession proceeded along a gradient. It was linear from pioneering stage after a disturbance to old growth conditions, and it just kind of went across this linear gradient. But that's not the case. It's circular, and the stages are interconnected. And on the left of that is a beautiful picture of an old growth forest. And I've spent most of my career studying and documenting the biodiversity, but it wasn't until in 2008 that I took a hike with my 8-year-old daughter at the time when she saw all the biodiversity in that slide on the right. An extreme in a high severity burn was just populated with all kinds of pollinators and insectivorous birds, and plants were coming back, flowering plants. And I'd start to think, I don't know what a forest is, because I've trained my eye for the left side of the slide and not the right. But these are interconnected pathways. They're on a process that all ecosystems go through. So I talked to David Lindemeyer about it, and we published this paper in Biological Conservation this year on circular succession. So you got an old growth, this cartoon version, that goes through a natural disturbance that becomes complex early seral, that goes through post-disturbance recovery, and then becomes old growth again. That's the circularity. And I now I'm thinking about it even more. I wouldn't even call it recovery, because in terms of blackback woodpeckers that use the snag forest, recovery is from the green forest. So it's really important to see nature as nature and not our human bias. So I'm going to have to go back to David and make correction on that cartoon that we did. And this is what active management does. It interrupts that circularity. So you got a high conservation value forest on the right there, maybe it's old growth, and then active management comes in with thinning, fire breaks, it gets into this degraded state where you've got fragmentation, you've got post-fire logging, you've reduced the canopy, you've impaired the ecosystem from going through its circularity, and you've gone through this process and disrupted what's supposed to occur in nature. Okay, so then, what we started to dwell on is, well, how do we get this out there so that folks know what they're dealing with is restoration or degradation? How do you know? And I think one of the first principles is you got to have a reference site. And so many of these Forest Service treatments don't have reference conditions. They keep looking in the rearview mirror about historical conditions when the climate is shifting. And so instead, what we're saying is you got to have a reference site, an area that has high integrity that you see in the slide and in that illustration as well as your reference site. And then what you do to it is going to determine how far removed you are from the reference condition as to whether you're doing restoration or degradation. And in our paper, the one prior to the one that you saw on that David Lindenmayer and I did, we came up with this table of principles, criteria, indicators, verifiers. Kind of think of this as a checklist. I can only have enough room for it on to show one part of the table. I think it's a 3 pages long table of these different indicators and verifiers, but you can take this out in the field as a checklist and give it a scoring. And you can plot that scoring as what we're calling a spider diagram that you see in the middle of the screen there. So you've got your reference site that has no degradation in the center of that spider diagram. And then you've got different treatment sites with their scorings relative to the reference site. So you can see how far removed they are from reference conditions and the degree of degradation or restoration. So this is one way of getting it done analytically. It needs to get out in the field and tested. That's the next thing that we're encouraging folks to do, is to take that checklist out in the field and start testing it. But you can kind of see it in just looking at these areas that have been claimed as active management restoration. And the one thing that Lindenmayer and I talk about in our most recent paper is the cumulative disturbance burden on ecosystems. You can kind of look at this as in terms of the NEPA process, cumulative impacts, right? And so ecosystems have a natural disturbance background that's always running in the background. And they're adapted to that, they're resilient to it. But then you pile on all these other disturbances using the indicators approach versus the reference conditions, and you push them to the point of thresholds where they will type convert. The upper left slide there is from a fuel reduction treatment in the Santa Fe watershed that used to be mostly a pine, somewhat mixed conifer forest. It's now an open savanna, weed infested, and those trees on that slope incline, upper elevation, are just wind sails ready to blow down. So this is definitely not restoration. There was a Forest Service kiosk in the area talking about that center upper one as being mistletoe restoration. That's a weed infested, soil damaged system that is degradation, not restoration. And then you throw on all these other stresses, cows, ORVs, logging roads, and you're pushing it further and further away from a reference site. So know thy reference when you're dealing with these Forest Service treatments, and use that checklist to determine how far removed they are from reality. And you can see all the emphasis that's going into this now with this kind of blank check that's going into active management in the various legislative processes, and now the Trump administration throwing even more at it. So we're pushing these ecosystems to their cumulative disturbance burden. And this is the one that really bugs me. We need to get into these old growth forests, do commercial logging to fireproof them. And instead, you're getting degradation because these forests are already relatively naturally fire resistant. The big trees drop their lower branches, they thicken up their bark, they have really moist microclimates, they're a wind buffer. When you get in there and you open up the canopy, you thin out the forest, then you're taking away those resilient and resistant properties. And the old forests really are the fire refugia. And as I mentioned, when the logging occurs in these forests, we're seeing the same pattern. Now, we've even documented it in Eastern Canada. That paper by Brendan Mackey, another Australian that I've been working with, is in press. It should be out any week now. Those big fires that blanketed the East Coast a couple of years ago and went all the way down to the Carolinas were occurring in Quebec and Ontario. And what we learned from that is they were burning under extreme fire weather, and they were racing through clear cuts, and they were slowing down in the boreal old growth that had lower fire intensities, just like we're seeing in Western United States, Western Canada, Southeast Australia. It's the same damn pattern. And the logged areas are burning hot and fast because they're windier, they're dried out, and they have dense regrowth. Yet the management is opposite. So I think in a nutshell, active management needs a facelift. It needs a new non-Orwellian narrative to really kind of speak the truth of what's going on instead of what we think is happening. And I'm not totally anti-active management. And there's so many things we can be doing proactively in the forest by working with nature instead of against nature. And that's treating root causes and remove the stressors. There's, cows in the streams, the road system, the weeds that are in the burn piles, the ORVs that are making illegal roads, the logging that's occurring in old growth forests. These are all stressors that can be removed from the system to allow it to recover. And if you're going to do treatments, prioritize the industrial logged areas. Those are the places that are burning hot and fast. That's where the treatments should be targeting, not the public forest and not the old forest. And it's again, the spillover of these fires is coming mainly out of private lands, at least in the Pacific Northwest. And yet all the emphasis is on treating the public lands. The road system is a major problem, as you saw for fire ignitions. Okay, so close more of these seasonally, obliterate the ones that are causing damage to streams. We have, get this, there are 380,000 miles of roads on the National Forest System, enough to drive around the globe 16 times. Those roads have major problems to ecosystems. The Forest Service can't even maintain them, let alone add more roads by rescinding the roadless rule. We could be reintroducing imperiled and keystone species. Beavers are a good example of slowing down water, and that's going to be really essential as the climate shifts, especially in the drier parts of the western US. We could do more prescribed burning and especially cultural burning, but we've got to be careful with this because overburning, which is occurring in the Southwest, is type converting the forest to more of a shrubland system because the conifers can't come back, they're burning too frequently. And working more with wildland fire under safe conditions is going to accomplish more fuel reduction than any kind of active management can. There's all kinds of weed removal that can happen, both terrestrial and aquatic. I'm not suggesting that we move away from fire suppression to protect communities, but let's get more realistic about what we can do and use more defensible space and structure-based management. Removing dams is a good way to rewild the aquatic and the terrestrial systems. All right, so I've loaded you folks up with a fire hose of information. I'm going to turn it back over to the facilitators to facilitate the Q&A.
Okay, everybody, we'll get started on the Q&A. If you have not already, feel free to put any questions into the Q&A section, and I'll go through those first, and then I'll also get the ones in chat for those of you who do not have access to the Q&A. So first of all, from Maya, can you please talk a little bit about the loss of wildlife as we lose the complex structure of forests by thinning?
Yeah, hi Maya, thanks for that. I love softballs like that. Wildlife have a habitat preference and a climate envelope preference. And so when you alter that, you are definitely going to see loss. And the structure-based approach in forest management and forest ecology has been in place for decades. So wildlife see forest a niche, a gestalt. Their view of a forest ecosystem is structure-based. It's to know where your habitat is. So if you're plucking out big trees, for instance, you're going to remove habitat for goshawks and for owls. And a lot of active management will go after those large trees to pencil out the thinning sale. And not only is that counterproductive to reducing fire risks, but you're taking out habitat. And so this is the same thing with a complex early cereal forest. It's just a different community. Whether we're looking at old growth or complex early cereal, the circular succession joins them, and they're both important. And the really interesting thing about a stem replacing fire is this is a critical pulse of biological legacies to ecosystems that they may not see for decades to centuries. And that pulse is associated with high levels of biodiversity, especially the cavity nesting birds, and the small mammals that use it for denning, and the raptors that come in and feed on the small mammals. It's all important habitat. And so when you take those elements out, if you're doing thinning and old growth, or if you're doing post fire salvage in a complex early cereal forest, you're going to have major impacts to wildlife. The blackback woodpecker is a really great example of a very dependent species on the snag forest, the complex early cereal forest, that many of us think are in trouble because of all the salvage logging that happens after these high severity burns.
Thank you. Here's one from Kate. I'd like to know more about rainfall and water quantity from wildlands in the eastern states. Can you speak to this?
Oh, yeah, I need to get more information in my talks about eastern forest ecology. Uh, I think a lot of the work that I'm familiar with has been based in the Pacific Northwest, and we know that intact watersheds will retain and slowly release their water supply over the dry summer months much better than logged ecosystems. I think the same thing will apply regardless of where you are. If you intensively log a system, that water is just going to drain off really fast. It's going to, give you peak flow and then it's gone. Because the old forests, think of them as a sponge. And I know in the eastern United States, you don't have a lot of old growth forest left, but you've got a maturing forest system. And that mature forest is only a couple of decades away from having old growth characteristics, but it's still going to function as a giant sponge that's going to soak up the atmospheric water. It's going to slowly release it through evapotranspiration because of the link to the hydrological cycle, and it's going to return it to the streams, especially during the dry summer months. So I think that the principle will hold true regardless of whether you're east or west.
Kate, do you have another follow-up?
So I have some follow-ups because I've been looking at the Forest of Faucets
Yeah,
USDA sites. And so because we're trying to, I'm in Massachusetts and we've got legislation that we're desperately trying to convince legislators that it's going to impact our water supply if we continue logging in our watersheds. And, I've got the Forest of Faucets maps up and we're sharing them, showing that the Catskills and the Adirondacks, where they're wildlands, they're permanently preserved, have 100% capacity to produce clean water. And there's almost nothing in Massachusetts that's over 73%. There's a tiny bit of stuff that's like 75%. So we're working with those maps, but we're looking for more data about water quantity as well as clean water quality. And I'm just wondering if there's any research that you can point us towards. And we'd also love for you to come and speak because we've got a whole community of tree advocate groups here that would love to hear your research, not only about fire, but particularly about water quality and quantity, because fire isn't as big of an issue here in the East.
yeah,
Water is our big issue. And we just watched as the largest reservoir in Massachusetts, Boston's water supply, in 3 months of drought, their capacity dropped 10% in 3 months. And if we
wow,
extended drought, and this is from the, mass.gov website, we just looked at it, it dropped 10% in 3 months of drought. And we want to really be able to highlight that for the legislators, like what's going to happen when we get 6 months, 9 months, 12 months? What's going to happen to that reservoir?
yeah,
That's Boston's water supply.
yeah,
We really want, it's like one thing for us as citizens to talk about this, but we would really love for you to come
sure.
and share your information with us here, and we're going to try to get our legislators to come.
Yeah, I've worked with Zach Porter a bit, so
Yes,
Zach's
Zach's
great.
part of our network, and he's part of the team that want to bring you to do a webinar here.
Yeah. Yeah, simply put, trees are carbon and water, and that's going to be their biggest ecosystem benefit in a changing climate. And so when you cut them down, you're losing both. And a lot of the work that's been done on the national forest system shows that, the national forests are often at the headwaters of water supply. And I know you don't have a lot of national forest in the Northeast, but again, the principle holds true. If you don't log it, you're going to have more water in your system over a longer period of time. And you're also going to be drawing down carbon, which is really important to slowing down climate change on a global scale. So I think what we're going to see is these forests are going to become increasingly valuable to us as the natural climate solutions. And we get these services for free, and yet we treat them as if they're unlimited. And I know that again, back to my graduate school days, some of the early ecosystem services evaluation work has been done in the Adirondacks. And if I recall correctly, what they found was if you add up all the benefits of having an intact watershed, you're going to have a much healthier reservoir system and you won't need to put in another dam because the trees are doing it for you to store water and slowly release it. So I think that was done in the 1980s, so I'm sure that information is out there. I'm not as familiar with the research on the Eastern United States as I am elsewhere. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
bringing it up, though.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Here's one from Craig. And Craig, I'll just summarize with the first line. Why and when did common sense become an enemy of higher education and science? And this is specifically referring to, per Craig, when do we realize how 100 years of management has significantly altered our once sustainable forests into fire-prone plantations?
Yeah, hi, Craig. Thanks for that. That's a philosophical question, and I go back to simple answer: money grows on trees, and the faster you can grow that money, the better it is for your shareholders. And that's the way a lot of the timber companies look at this. And despite all the rhetoric, the Orwellian misinformation out there, it's being cloaked behind the money tree. That's what it comes down to, plain and simple. Get the trees out as fast as you can because that's the money thing. And yet, what we see as ecologists and advocates is the opposite because we see nature the way nature is. And what we see from that is, as you mentioned, the plantations are the fire bombs and the roads are the fuse. Tim Inglesby said that years ago. It's one of his greatest lines that we are making these ecosystems prone to the fires that we're wanting to put out. It's a vicious cycle, and we're kind of caught in this do loop of misinformation and management for profit. And that's not the way we should be looking at forest in a changing climate, in my opinion, as not only a scientist, but someone that has grandkids.
Thank you. Question from Ken. Were the Canadian fires over the past few years mainly due to management, i.e. forest management?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think what we can say is that, first of all, you have to have an ignition source, right? And then you have to have a landscape that is prone to fire. And to have an ignition source, you've got to also have the right atmospheric conditions. And so what we are doing is changing every one of those. So we change the ignition sources by having too many roads on the landscape. Can't do anything about lightning, but man, if we put a lot of roads out there, we've got a lot of access. And you saw that one measle map, the different colors of all the ignition percentages due to humans. Same thing applies in Canada. Now you also we have been treating the atmosphere as a dumping ground for our emissions, and that's causing all kinds of havoc across the planet. We crossed another planetary boundary just last week, coral reef collapse. The atmosphere, many of us are already saying, has crossed a threshold. And we're already seeing major impacts without even, being at the worst of it by far. And so we have primed the atmosphere to be ready for more fire. And yet, on top of that, the mismanagement of the forests by converting fire refugia, which are the old forests, to fire proneness, which are what's coming in with the plantations, you got we created this bomb and we can't fix it by making more bombs, by making more active management on the landscape, because all we're doing is putting more emissions into the atmosphere. When you take those trees out, most of the carbon winds up upstairs, and you're type converting the system, especially in Canada, where it's really hard to grow trees in the boreal. Uh, if we can even grow them back with a changing climate. So, I mean, we're the cause, but we need to be the solution now.
Thank you. Here is a really relevant question from Theodosia. And the question is replanting factored into your work? And she says, replanting half-grown pines, et cetera, can capture half as much carbon as old growth. And is this factored into your work?
I don't necessarily agree with that, but I would use a step down process. The best way to capture and store carbon long term, because it's not just a capture question, you have to look at the whole balance sheet, is to protect the forest that you already have, especially the old ones. Those large trees in those older forests may represent somewhere 2 to 3% of the stem density that are absorbing and storing 40 to 50% of the above ground carbon. That's irreplaceable. And it doesn't slow down. Popular press says it slows down. Some publications from the 80s and 90s says it slows down. The latest information shows that they keep accumulating, individual trees keep accumulating carbon. And as trees get bigger and bigger, that's more carbon that's stored. And then we have the soils as well. So I would look at it as a step down. Protect your old forest, your primary forest, your complex early cereal forests, which still have most of their carbon, just transfers from live to dead trees. Then you can look at other ways to reduce emissions in logging operations, taking less, don't take the big trees. That would generate less emissions. In places that have been logged, you can plant, but you're never going to catch up to the carbon debt that was put in the atmosphere by logging, let's say, a mature and old growth forest. And in places that are fallowed agricultural fields, you can plant trees and quick growing trees and take up carbon. But you've got to look at it as a step down process. And the most important thing is to stop deforestation and forest degradation. And the IPCC has concluded that several times, that one of the principal causes of emissions is from logging. Over 10% of the global total is coming from logging of forests, which is equivalent to more than the entire aviation sector's emissions load. So that's one area that has to be plugged with better forest management and protecting what we have out there that is primary old growth. And primary is also unlogged complex early cereal forests.
Thank you. So here's a question from Brent. Can you talk about carbon credits as a way for a private owner to quit logging? In particular, Brent says he would like to leave his private forest alone without logging, but it's very expensive to buy forest. And his observation in his forest, which is far from any community, has been, I'm not sure if I'm clear on this. Anyway, it appears, Brent, can you say your statement that you want to see if somebody's pushing back on?
I'll have to unmute.
Oh, okay. Anyway, he says, an observation, my forest, away far from any community, has been in a QUIP project, spending 2,000 per acre of tax dollars to treat the forest for fire safety. Is anyone pushing back on this? And I'll go ahead and unmute you, but go ahead and take that one, Dominic, to the best of your ability.
Yeah, so I'm kind of an agnostic on carbon credits. I can see it having some value. It's not going to save the climate, but it might save some trees. And to give you an example, and I think it really is important for private landowners, especially the woodlot owners that are trying to do the right thing, to have a financial incentive to manage their forest for carbon. I really support that. And I've gotten into situations where I've seen it backfire, and it backfired on me. And the case in point would be the Sea Alaska Native Corporation that had advanced to the point of being interested in a carbon offset agreement. And we got to the table on it. We showed them how they could do it. I then lost my funding, so I had to move on to something else. They went forward with the agreement. They sold a carbon offset on 80,000 acres of their forest, about 60,000 acres of which was old growth, agreeing not to log. They got $100 million for it, and they sold the rights to British Petroleum to do more oil and gas development. So that caused me to bang my head against the wall. That's not the intent I wanted to have happen. And as I mentioned, it could save some forests. It could give private landowners a stream of revenue as an alternative to, carbon management, but it's not going to save the climate, unfortunately, because we're never going to get to scale unless we had $1 trillion and we could just buy off all the logging in the Amazon.
Brent, did that clarify, or do you want to clarify your question? And also, what's the cost per acre again that you're seeing?
That's that's the EQIP projects that are going on. That's federally funded forest treatment. So it's the federal government is funding forest treatment for fire safety. So thinning, limbing, brush pile burning, and broadcast burning, and they're doing it, way outside of communities. So I don't know. I did that on my own, about 100 acres of private forest before I really, back when I thought that was a good idea. And it seems the more I'm learning here that that's maybe not such a great idea. And I'm just wondering if anyone is addressing that, because I think there's thousands of dollars of millions of dollars of tax dollars being spent on this. And back to the carbon credits, if that's, I wonder also, Mr. DellaSala, if you are aware of anyone that's been able to do a conservation easement on a forest. So in other words, agree to not log the forest in perpetuity and create a donation the same way conservation easements are created for, say, not to develop an area. Should I clarify that at all, or does that make
Let me
sense?
see if I could take a shot at it. But thanks again for being proactive about this and trying something different. I love innovation. I like the way you're thinking. I will say that what you described, firstly, the thinning, the fire stuff, it doesn't pencil out. Every single study in the independent literature that's been peer reviewed, especially the work of Dr. Bev Law, it just shows it doesn't pencil out. You wind up putting more emissions into the atmosphere than the fire event would have put, because to get to scale, you got to go big in order to have a fire intersect the area on the ground that you're treating. And to go big means you're putting more emissions into the atmosphere than what you're going to get from the disturbance event that you're trying to avoid. So again, this is kind of misinformation, borderline Orwellian speak, that just drives me nuts to see that. Now, as far as your conservation easement approach, yeah, I could see that happening, for a legitimate project. But the thing is, to get a carbon credit, you have to show additionality, and you have to deal with whether or not the site was at risk to be logged. And if it was, and you're not going to log it, then that delta, that difference is what's used to calculate the carbon credit. But if you were already going to protect it and you're just putting an easement on it, and thank you for that, I don't think you can get a carbon credit unless you had a forest management plan that said, I'm going to clear cut this whole area unless somebody pays me, $8, $10 on a ton of carbon for the acreage that I'm not going to log. That's additionality.
Oh.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You bet.
I'm going to keep going to the next question unless, Kate, you had something urgent that was directly relevant to this one, or
This
I'm-
is relevant to this question about conservation.
okay, cool. Sure.
In our state, Massachusetts, we give our residents tax abatements to log their forests. And we are going to be requesting in our legislatures to give those same tax abatements to save their forest for the watershed and carbon and regional cooling benefits. So with, I don't know what happens in other states, but this is the madness that has degraded all our watersheds and regional cooling in Massachusetts. And it is exactly what we need to do is give people tax abatements to conserve their land for all the benefit, their forests for all the climate benefits.
Yeah, that's smart. That makes sense to me.
Can I make a brief comment along those lines?
Go ahead, Brent.
I guess I can. Yeah. So here in California, we have zoning, production zone, TPZ zoning, which is a huge tax credit. It's used by the industrial foresters in California, way cheaper than typical property tax. But what I don't, and the way that the counties collect tax is they collect it on the timber that you log off of those forests. That's the way they make up the tax difference. And what I'm wondering is what happens if I use my local land trust and say, I want to conserve this forest in perpetuity. I'm never going to log it. I'm going to donate the stumpage value. Will the county then come back and say, you can't do that without changing your zoning, which of course then makes it about 10 times more expensive for me. So that kind of addresses what you're talking about in your state too.
Yeah,
Any
it's a
comments on that,
disincentive.
Mr. DellaSala? Have you run across this problem and how it
Yeah,
seems like
it's a
it's really
disincentive.
hard to save a forest?
Yeah, it's upside down. And I would work with your local land trust. And again, Brent, thanks so much for being innovative about this. We should have more private landowners out there willing to kind of look at this, but this is kind of something a land trust would be a lot more knowledgeable in helping. Like Pacific Forest Trust would be a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the discussion. So this is from Clinton. How do you see us gaining the younger generation into real activism more so than just marching in protest movements?
Yeah, Clint, thanks for that. I end all my talks with a plea to young people, passing the baton. I get really excited when I see young people coming to my talks and I see young people giving talks. I see them out on the street protesting. Greta Thunberg is one of my heroes. And I also like working with the 13 grandmothers, the Native American grandmothers that have been working around the planet to get people and governments to wake up. If I had the answer to that, I would be a happier person. And as I mentioned, I have grandkids, so I would love to see more young people leading the way on this because we're fucking it up for them. And I actually was pretty motivated. I know Chris is on the call, but Adam Reeson's son motivated me recently. I think he was 8 years old when he jumped on the table at one of their meetings and said, "You guys have to save this place for me because I'm coming into this." 8 years old, he said that. And so when I see that and I hear that, it gives me hope.
Go Harry.
Yes.
That's amazing. Thank you. Okay, this one is, could you compare the logging in the Amazon to the new attack on the land in Alaska that was just opened through the CRA resolution? What are the carbon comparisons and effect on the climate?
Bad, 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 and worse. It's just terrible, right? The Amazon is the lungs of the planet, and we're close to a tipping point. on the Amazon. It's crossed the threshold on drought, I believe, 2 or 3 times in the last 2 decades. And it's because of the logging there changes the regional climate. When you clear cut over large landscapes in the Amazon, you shift the weather patterns to the point where it's self-reinforcing. The collapse is self-reinforcing, and we're so close, unfortunately, to collapse in the Amazon. And when that happens, all bets are off. As to the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, I worry about that too. I mean, the Tongass is, I have a love affair with the Tongass. For the past 30 years, I've been going back and forth there. It's a remarkable place, one of a kind. There's only a handful of relatively intact temperate rainforest in the world. The Tongass, the Great Bear to the south, the Valdivian rainforest in Chile, a couple of places in Russia, and Tasmania. That's it in terms of relatively intact forest. And we do know that while the Amazon on a per area basis total has more carbon, on a per acre basis, the old forest on the Tongass are globally significant because they are storing incredible amounts of carbon per acre in mostly the big trees again, right? We talked about this earlier. You can't replace those big trees. You can't make up for those big trees by planting 10 trees per one big tree you take out because that big tree has got hundreds of years of carbon stored in its mass and you're never going to catch up. No one's lifetime is going to be hundreds of years. So you're never going to catch up to the carbon debt that you create into the atmosphere. And it's really unfortunate that we're seeing kind of parallel processes playing out in some of the most important forests on the planet. And those are the life support systems, the lungs of the planet, and the only way we're going to have any hope at a natural climate solution when we try to get the hell off of fossil fuels.
Thank you. From Patricia, if you owned a substantial forest, could you go over the steps you would use to care for that forest, if any?
Oh, sure. I would go out there and I would hug all the big trees. I mean, if forests don't need us, we need forests. And they'll do perfectly fine without us. Something else will come up in their place, and I'm sure it'll be biodiverse. The real question is, how do we really become stewards? Instead of taking, what are we going to leave? Instead of degrading, what can we restore? Instead of looking at active management as a solution to the same problems that we're creating, how do we change active management so it's part of the solution? So, if I had an old growth forest in my backyard, I'd go out there every day and hug a big tree because there's nothing else you need to do.
Thank you so much. Here's one from Nicholas. Many conservation organizations appear to be against commercial treatments that take out some older trees, but they support non-commercial or ecological treatments that only target younger trees alongside manager ignited prescribed fire use. Where would this be appropriate if most Western forests have infrequent fire regimes, and even the frequent fire regimes have stand replacing components over long enough time scales, and if they have proximity to higher elevation terrain like forests around Flagstaff, Arizona?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I kind of dwell on this a lot myself, right? So, yeah, you could do something like that and, focus on the small trees. Don't take a whole boatload of small trees or a whole logging truck full of small trees because we get into problems too with taking too much out of the understory and burning too frequently is what I'm seeing in the Southwest where they are opening up the forest so much they don't have to do commercial logging in that system. They just drop the trees and burn them. And yet what's happening is the oaks are coming in and they're not getting a forest to come back. So you could still mess it up by taking small trees. So it comes down to, again, know thy reference condition. And if one of your goals is to restore the big tree component, what's your reference condition, right? And then you could take out some small trees, but don't overdo it and don't overburn it. And that's the trick of restoration. It's a science and an art. And I've seen a lot of the projects in the Southwest where they say that they're not doing commercial thinning, but the impact is as bad as commercial thinning is because they've taken so many trees. That one slide I showed you of the Santa Fe watershed, that's not a commercial thinning project, but that's a project that has done so much thinning that it's type converted the system to an open savanna that's going to be invaded by oak, shifting more to weed infested area and blowdown. So it really comes down to not just avoiding commercial logging, but what's the structure and the process and the function going to look like, and what is it in comparison to your reference site?
Thank you so much. I'm shifting over to the chat, which has a few questions in it. So the first question is, Chad Hansen and those who agree say we ought to have no prescribed burning is mentioned in a recent book by Jordan Thomas, When It All Burns. Do you agree with Jordan Thomas that we do need to burn, but that we must burn with the subtlety of the indigenous peoples or not at all?
I'm not sure Chad is totally anti-prescribed burning, so I
Yeah.
don't think that's accurate. And whatever in that book is not the Chad I know.
Yeah.
And prescribed burning is a tool. It can be effective under certain conditions. It's important that it not be confused with pile burning. I've seen that a lot. Hey, we're doing prescribed burning, and what they're really doing is burning slash intensely cooking the soil horizons, killing mycorrhizae relationships. That's not prescribed burning. And I would love to see more cultural burning. I totally support cultural burning because it's a holistic view. And it's not just looking at fire as a tool to reduce slash, it's actually looking at fire holistically as a force of nature that we can work with. If you remember from the slide I showed, work with nature instead of against it. So I see a lot of value to cultural burning because the indigenous component there is really important to get back on the landscape. And it's different than prescribed burning, which is different from pile burning.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it was my understanding Dr. Hansen's not completely against prescribed burning either.
Yeah.
So he, in fact, I think participated in writing Sierra Club's new prescribed burn policy that they did in the last couple of years as part of a collaborative team. I think the bigger thing that Dr. Hansen was for was really being careful about it and not
Yeah.
just having a one size fits all.
Yeah, and I support that. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's being used so frequently in the Southwest every 1 to 3 years that the forests aren't coming back. They're being overburned.
Thank you. So here's one from Terry. I'm a proponent of saving every tree, from Terry. Others say saving old growth or legacy is more important. She asks, how do we unite those views?
Yeah. So saving every tree, if it were up to me, I wouldn't cut a tree. But if you see my background, I've got guitars hanging on my wall. I've got a bookshelf made of wood. I live in a house made of wood. And sure, there are alternatives. So I think we need to look at it as a, a solution that has to have a global solution driven by local needs. And that means a couple of things, finding alternatives to wood products, wood fiber. They're out there, hemp, a lot of other products, hempcrete can be used that need to be looked at as alternative, reduce wasteful consumption. If we could do those two things, we could reduce the demand on the remaining primary old growth forests so that we're not liquidating them. And that's going to require a global solution. And currently, we've got 8.4 billion people consuming a whole lot of resources around the planet, a lot of waste. It's mind-boggling when you think about how big this problem is and how that global population trends aren't going to level off, presumably, until the end of the century when we have some 9 or 10 billion people consuming more of the world's resources. We already need about 1.4 Earths to sustain our current population. So we've got to reduce our consumption, look for alternatives, save what we've got left. If we're going to do triage, save those big trees, the old forest, the complex early cereal forest, the primary forest, the ones that are having this kind of basket of ecosystem benefits that we're not getting out of the heavily managed system as we look at other ways to get our consumption levels met.
Thank you for that. So Mary asks if we can have a copy of your paper without going through a paywall.
Oh, which one?
Mary, do you want to unmute yourself and say?
Or send me an email and I'll send you a copy.
And are you able to share your email?
Oh, yeah. Should I put that? I'll put that in the message to everybody.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Well, I got to remember what it is because I just changed jobs.
Yes, and if anybody has been using Dr. DellaSala's old email, maybe switch over to this one apparently.
Yeah. I try to get open access, but it's really expensive to pay for those. But you can just ping me if you need any of these publications.
Okay.
And I would really highly recommend query my name and Manga Bay, and you'll see the point counterpoint. There are two articles, so it's not just one, between me and Paul Hesberg on active management, because that really summarizes our differences.
Thank you. So here's another one. It's from Terry. Terry asks, do any of the studies you reference take into consideration native stewardship that was outlawed 200 years ago in the US?
I would love to work with Native people on that. And I think that there's a real role for Western science to work with traditional ecological knowledge. And so I would welcome that opportunity.
Thank you. So here's a question from Larry. Larry says that the statewide program only includes two factors, crowded forests and climate, leaving out logging entirely as if it has nothing to do with fires. Why is logging left out, and also the factors for moisture and wind? Is this science?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, but that's really my entire presentation, right? It's Orwellian misinformation. It's money grows on trees. And it's this perception that we can cure the problem with the same factors that cause the problem. If you get a chance to, while you're querying papers, or you can contact me, the 2022 paper that I did on the analogy that I used was Sisyphus. Has contemporary forest management become, or has forest management become a contemporary version of Sisyphus, the Greek mythological figure that was trying to bind Hades with chains so there would never be death, and then Hades figured out how to get out of the chains and put Sisyphus into this never-ending pushing the boulder up the hill that he could never get to. It's what the Forest Service is doing, right? There are Sisyphus, and climate change is the hill, or maybe climate change is Hades, making the hill bigger and bigger and bigger. And you're never going to push that active management boulder up that hill if you're treating the effects and not the causes.
Thank you. So this is from Rick. There are plenty of studies that contradict the flawed federal policy of restoring fire resilience with massive commercial timber sales. But this information is being deliberately ignored by the feds, says Rick. What can we do to better circulate these studies and force the logging oriented agencies to acknowledge them?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I think getting more scientists involved is really important. And this is where we come back to that earlier message about, young people. And I would love to see more young scientists getting involved in this. I wrote a book a few years ago, Conservation Science and Advocacy in a Planet in Crisis, Speaking Truth to Power, uh, with ways for scientists to get more involved in outreach and advocacy. So we have a tendency, especially in academic circles, to stay inside our little network and preach to the choir. But it's really important that scientists are out there and giving this information to decision makers. And whether or not they use it is another story. But we need to see more of that. And that's, documented in my book that came out, I think it was in 2020 or 2022, on how to do that and how to get more scientists that are out there spreading the information that needs to get out there to decision makers.
That would be great. So a related question on science. Pam, did you have a related follow-up question on this one?
No, actually, it's a little bit different, but I have to leave. I was just hoping that I could ask a question about the wildland urban interface, or when forests come right up to communities, and homeowners are terrified. So what do you recommend for the forests that are near cities and towns?
Yeah. So the so-called WUI thing, it's an outdated concept. It has really nothing to do with a WUI. What it has to do is the home ignition zone itself. Home hardening, defensible space, narrow zone, 50 to 100 feet around the house itself. And the really cool and interesting thing about it is Jack Cohen, a retired Forest Service guy, had a lab that he set up, really big building. He would make these experimental houses and get this giant fan and blow embers at those houses. And the ones that were hardened didn't burn, and the ones that weren't hardened went up like a torch. And he also took his experiments out into the forest. And same thing, homes hardened, survived the burn. Homes not hardened, burned up. And it has nothing to do with anything outside that 50 to 100-foot zone, which is why the WUI is outdated. And personally, I lost half of my town in Southern Oregon in the Labor Day fires of 2020, while the Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy were spending millions of dollars in the backcountry thinning. Years later, my 3,000 structures in my town burned down in a single day. That was a climate-driven event. And when structure to structure, it had nothing to do with the forest. It was all about structure as the fuel.
Wow. So you're saying you don't do anything in the WUI either?
I'm saying whatever you do in the WUI is not going to affect what happens at the house. And there's experimental evidence on that. And which is why I showed that slide, the 3 or 4 ecoregions where we're looking at this, up to 3/4 of the Forest Service treatments, hundreds of them are more than a kilometer away from the nearest structure. That's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
I mean, you
But
can
with
close roads and reduce the ignition probability, obliterate roads, have a properly managed ingress and egress system to get people in and out, smoke filters, air filters, smoke shelters, evacuation route information. When my town burned down, there was no coordinated evacuation system. Nobody knew where to go, when to leave. There wasn't even a siren warning system. It's because all the money's being spent in the wrong place.
Yeah. So you would say that all the fuel reduction treatment money should just be switched over to home hardening?
If your goal is to protect communities, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also uh, reduce ex-urban sprawl. I mean, we keep building homes in these unsafe places. We don't build on top of a volcano. Why are we building in places that are going to burn down, like inside canyons with limited escape routes, like what's going on or has happened in California? You can't get a fire truck in and out of it. Where, close to where I live in Ashland, I talk to firefighters all the time. They can't get their rigs in some of these places because they can't turn a fire truck around. And yet you've got hundreds of homes back there. It's a mess.
Yeah.
And fuel treatment is not the answer if you want to save homes. And I was blown away by how many houses in my watershed still have uh, wood-based roofing material. You're asking for trouble if you've got no home hardening. Um, and that's the way to deal with this problem most effectively.
Do you know of any community that has been successfully as a community hardened all the homes together? Because if everybody doesn't harden and one house catches fire or two houses catch fire, then everybody else, all the neighbors are in danger too. So it's something that really needs to be done as a group.
Yeah, I'm not aware of it. I'm sure it's happening. Jared Huffman has a bill out there to redirect the funding, just like what we're talking about. And that's what needs to happen because now you got a funding stream and you can get communities to work together in actually addressing the risk for everybody. Because if you have one house that doesn't do it, it creates a domino effect.
Yeah. Well, it's sobering.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really sobering topic. And Pam, did that answer the question you put into the chat also? You said, how close can natural fire get to a community before intervention occurs?
Well, that's, yeah, a little bit different. Could you answer that too?
Yeah, it depends on the fire. It depends on fire weather. There's a lot of factors involved. I mean, we could be working with wildland fire for ecosystem benefits under safe conditions. And we don't do enough of that, even though it's in the Forest Service policy. They get a lot of pushback from county commissioners, from property owners, from politicians saying, put out every single fire. And then you never get any wildland fire management going on except when nature does it, regardless of what we throw at it. And in certain fire weather conditions, there's no way you can stop these fast fires. But I've had forest managers tell me that they know they can't stop it, but they have to try. Otherwise, they lose their jobs. And it's not safe for firefighters. And it doesn't stop fast fires because in some of these cases, you've got fire weather that's created by the fire front itself. So you've got pyro tornadoes. No one wants to be out there putting out a fire. So there's no way you can stop those. But yeah, if a fire is barreling down on a community, you're going to want to throw everything you can at it, but don't expect that you're going to be able to stop it in these extreme fire weather conditions. It's just there are forces of nature that are beyond our control.
But that's it. Are there kind of rules that if, it's really windy and hot, that then you try to stop a fire, I don't know, 5 miles or 10 miles away from a community? If the weather's better, then you'll let it get, I don't know. But people are so worried that I think people want to know that there are policies out there that are going to protect them. And
Yeah.
so when you tell them, okay, this fuels reduction treatment doesn't work. In fact, it can make things worse. Then they want to know, well, what else can be done.
I'm just telling you what the science says.
Yeah,
So, I mean, it's
just
a
go with the
show.
home hardening. Yeah.
It's basically an air show, right? Under those conditions, they're going to throw everything they can at it. They may be able to get a handle on some of it. You see the containment percentages that the fire folks report on when a fire is happening, and they do get a handle on it. But when it's really blowing and you got drought and you got a heat dome, get out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maya, do you want?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to one of the it seems like a very powerful tool that you were using, Dominic, the indicators, know your reference, so you were talking about, let's check out all, it's Lindenmayer, and you have published, an idea of indicators, solid indicators in a forest, and you go to a reference site. I'm a little puzzled. I think I've been interested in that for a long time, and I'm a little puzzled about how you would select a reference site, whether it should be a combination of an old growth element, and a burn forest, because I mean, how would you do that? And then what are the best ones you would use to compare that? What are the best, most
Yeah.
powerful indicators to compare it with those wrecked and thinned forests?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you'd have to stratify based on similar conditions, all things being equal, compared to the site that is degraded, all things being equal. So, I mean, you could use, for example, a complex early cereal forest and
Okay.
say, this is our reference condition, and we have, a degraded condition. We're missing the biological legacies. So how do we create biological legacies? Maybe you topple a bunch of trees. You kill some of the green trees to create snags. You could use an old growth forest as a reference condition. In Europe, it may be a semi-natural forest because they don't have much old growth left. So that's a topic for a whole nother paper in terms of how do you define a reference condition. And really kind of comes down to just knowing what you're dealing with, site specific, being able to document it for the condition that you want to improve, whether or not you want to improve it to having some structure in an early cereal that's not complex, or whether you're trying to recreate the conditions that'll eventually give you old growth, as the case of thinning to accelerate late successional characteristics in young stands in the Northwest Forest Plan. Then no one's ever going to see whether or not they got to old growth, but you're putting it on a trajectory using old growth as your reference.
Thank you. So, Dr. DellaSala, we have a number of questions that keep coming in. How long are you available to stay?
Let's go another 10 minutes and then I'm going to need a happy hour drink.
Okay, that's great. So David says best is to leave the forest to manage themselves, but is there a good in quotes way to harvest timber?
Yeah, I think there is. As I mentioned, you know, we live in wooden houses, right? So I get it. I think we can. I think structure, function, process is important. I've been to some FSC certified forests. Not all of them are good. Some of them are better than others. Some are better than industrial logged areas. I think that has some application potential. It's unfortunate, though, that FSC has kind of weakened its approach over the years. I was at one of the original meetings back in, I guess it was the 80s or 90s when I was working at World Wildlife Fund. A lot of excitement behind FSC. So FSC on private lands where you can encourage better stewardship, I think is the way to go. But you really have to have an honest accounting process for it to work the way, you'd have some integrity still left on the site.
So speaking of integrity and excellence, Janine asks if you know of excellent university programs that teach progressive and current science as you are teaching it.
Yeah, I think any program that has conservation biology is a good starting place. And I just came back from the University of Montana, Missoula, and I was really excited. There were young people at my talk, and Chris was there. No, he's young relative to me, so Chris Backman is on. I can see he's still there. So I was encouraged by that. They have conservation biology classes there. It's unfortunate that it's siloed. And so that's the thing is to break down those silos so that there's exchange across programs because the forestry people are all getting their science and their learning from the forestry department, and the conservation biology people are getting it from the conservation biology professors. So breaking down the silos is really important to have cross-disciplinary exchange.
Thank you. So Donna says she's bringing these ideas and studies to Washington State DNR and to legislators, and others are too, but people aren't hearing what they're saying. Do you have any templates or suggestions on how to get state government to act on what you're talking about?
Oh boy, I've been trying that for 45 years in the federal government, and look where it's got me. This is tough. And it's it's one of these systematic problems where it gets back to the education and the whole Orwellian concept. If you defund education, you eliminate critical thinking, then what I'm saying is radical, right? Because it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Some of it doesn't initially make sense, which is why you have to have critical thinking to actually look at what nature's doing. Now, it's my job as a scientist to get that in front of decision makers. It doesn't matter if it's a county commissioner, a state legislator, a member of Congress, a president, whatever. Um, it, it's the difficult thing is whether or not they'll understand it. I think a lot of the action, though, happens at the level of the legislative aides. If you could reach the legislative aides in their hearts and their minds, then you got a chance. And I had one legislative aide once tell me that, hey, you have an army of peer-reviewed studies that you come in with, and then industry comes in with their studies. Who am I to believe? And I said, oh, just believe me. That wasn't enough. So I had to just kind of just break it down, break it down to its elements like we're doing here, and leave them with fact sheets with contact information to get back to you. But it really comes down to being able to simplify these really complicated understandings that takes a lot of kind of critical thinking, and getting critical thinking back into the school system is the only way to avoid or at least lower the chances that you're going to run into decision makers that just don't understand it.
Thank you. So on a related note, Marilyn asks, were any scientists allowed to testify in the FOFA discussions in the Senate?
Not that I know of. When you have the one party that's in control, you're lucky you get a single witness that is against their their version of what they're trying to pass.
Thank you. So this is related to a previous question, but Maya asked, don't land trusts create massive thinning projects?
Depends on the land trust. I've got some good ones here that are really looking at property purchase, conservation easements. So maybe Maya knows something that I don't. I'm sure she does.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Karen asks, can you describe when active management is useful, if any? And I know you touched on this a little earlier, but
Yeah.
when would it be useful in a nutshell, and what would be helpful if it was ever useful?
Yeah, it's that last
I'm
slide.
talking about restoration. I'm talking about restoration, Dominic. Yeah.
Yeah, restoration, you bet. It's just another kind of active management, right? So it's active management
Right.
with intent to put the pieces back. But you got to really, the Bible on this is know thy reference condition. That says it all. And a lot of what I see on the ground is not based on a reference condition. For example, the Forest Service keeps trying to backcast to historical conditions when the climate was different. And so that's, it's a guidepost, but it's not really a reference condition. So you need to have reference condition, which is what my papers are about, basing it on ecological integrity, defined as natural species composition, processes and functions that you would expect for that site if it didn't have active management. And so it's a little squishy. You have to really get to determine it based on site conditions, which is what Maya and I were discussing, that's a whole nother paper in terms of what the reference condition is, but that's really the essentials in determining whether you are lifting the ecological integrity of a site over time based on the comparison to its reference condition.
Thank you. We still have a few more questions and just a few more minutes. Maya, did your question about reference sites get answered because you asked it verbally?
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to work on another paper, Maya, you and I. How's that?
All right. Sounds great.
Okay, thank you. So Karen asks, should our Forest Service be guided by and run by indigenous people with forest experience in their geographic area of traditional expertise?
I certainly think indigenous people should be involved, just like the rest of the public, involved in forest management decisions. I would support that. I think there's been a lot of recent work between the environmental community and the indigenous community to make sure indigenous values were incorporated into forest management. I think it's a great idea. I think we really need to come to terms about what we mean by forest management. And that's an issue for a whole nother phone call conversation.
Thank you. So Scott asks, you actually mentioned Jack Cohen already, so this may have been answered, but Scott says Jack Cohen had researched that a flame front won't ignite a surface past 150 yards. How do 100-mile-per-hour winds affect that?
Get out of town. Everything has limits. A 100-mile-an-hour wind is going to go right through your glass windows.
Yeah.
You're lucky you even have a structure left with 100-mile-an-hour winds. Think of a tornado. You know, a house isn't standing after a tornado, so if the fire doesn't get you, the wind will. Everything has limits, but what you're trying to do is decrease the odds that your house is going to burn down if you've done everything right. But if you got a 100-mile-an-hour blow and your windows are only shielded for 40 or 50-mile-an-hour winds, I hope you're not still in that house.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to finalize this one with Nicholas, and this will be our last question. What general advice do you have for strengthening advocacy of self-willed ecosystems when most conservationists have shifted towards supporting active approaches?
Yeah, that's a big one. All right, so when I was in grad school back then, when I was a youngster, we used to get into these debates about deep ecology and shallow ecology. And I've been a deep ecologist my entire career, which is nature has intrinsic value and nature doesn't need us, we need nature. That's my perspective, right? And over the years, I've worked with a whole ton of conservation organizations. And what I will say is that where I find the greatest number of deep ecologists are in the small organizations that are doing a lot of the work on the ground that are still true to their mission. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen in other organizations, but I'm putting a lot of my um, science support into the groups that are true to their mission. And I think that's where the funders need to go too, because it's those organizations that are still doing the groundwork, that are willing to speak for the voiceless, which is one of the 13 grandmothers that taught me, always speak for the voiceless, because nature is what we need to survive. And if we remain true to deep ecology views, it shouldn't matter whether we're a big or small conservation group, um, we're doing our part for the solution. But I've been putting most of my time in the small groups at this point.
I want to thank everybody who spoke up with a question in the chat or in the Q&A or in person. Thank you for coming. Thanks for hanging with us for so long. It really shows that people appreciated your talk. A lot of people in the chat said they appreciated your talk. So thank you, Dr. DellaSala, for coming and
You
educating
bet.
us.
And it sounds like I need to do more work on the eastern forest. So happy to talk to folks about that offline.